So in this first part of our chapter on groups and organization, we'll look at different types of groups. We'll start out with defining what a group is, followed by understanding the differences between in-groups and out-groups, and finally understanding what reference groups are. So sociologists distinguish between aggregates, categories, and groups. An aggregate is made up of individuals who temporarily share the same physical space but do not have a sense of belonging together. So it's just happened in terms of coincidence of same space and time that they're there together, such as riding the bus riders who may not really know each other or somehow connect to each other in any meaningful way, but they just happen to be in the same space at the same time on the bus. Category is a collection of people who have similar characteristics, but similar to aggregate, they are not connected in any meaningful way. So an example category is millennials. These individuals are born between a certain time period, and that's it. They are defined by the time period in which they're born, and so they're considered as a cohort or a category. Group is any collection of at least two people who interact with some frequency and who share some sense of aligned identity. So this could be, for example, students or friends who see each other quite regularly, and their share of identity is either that they're friends with each other, or that they are students, or that they're taking classes together, or they're struggling with the same materials, or they're all preparing for the same exam, and so on. So there is some sort of connection between them. So here, again, sociologists make a distinction between aggregate, category, and group. So within each of those, within each group, they can be further distinguished by two types, either primary or secondary groups. So primary groups refer to groups characterized by cooperative, intimate, long-term, and face-to-face relationship. So the group has more often than not, meet the expressive functions or the emotional needs of the members of this group. So an example would be for example, the family. So the primary group is very important that it becomes part of the individual's identity and the lens through which life is viewed. And it is essential to an individual's psychological well-being, as humans have an intense need for associations that promote feelings of self-esteem. Secondary groups are larger, relatively temporary, more anonymous, formal, and impersonal than primary groups, and are based on some interest or activity. Members are likely to interact on the basis of specific roles, such as president, manager, worker, or student. So in this way, secondary groups, the members in the secondary groups are brought together to work together to meet certain kind of pragmatic needs. So unlike primary groups whose primary function is really about expressive functions, whereas the second groups, the primary function are much more instrumental. So that's why the members are likely to interact with each other based on the basis of specific roles, their specific roles within that secondary groups. So within industrial societies, secondary groups have multiplied and become essential to our lives. Secondary groups tend to break down into primary groups within the larger group, such as friendship cliques at school or work. The primary group serves as a buffer between the individual and the needs of the secondary group. So again, secondary groups members are connected to each other because of some sort of pragmatic needs. However, members of the secondary groups, they can develop relationships, and those relationships can evolve, and the members consequently can form primary groups. So an example of secondary groups are like classmates. They're brought together because they have to be in the same class, and really it just so happened they're in the same class, similar age range, and they learn the same course material, have the same teacher, and they may even grow up together for at least several years. It is possible that classmates can over time become friends and even more, and that means that the classmates are now no longer just simply members of the secondary groups, but have developed into members of the primary groups. So within primary and secondary groups, there are InGroups. InGroup is a group a person belongs to and feels is an integral part of his identity. So there's a high level of loyalty within the InGroup. Meanwhile, so this could be, for example, sport teams. If you're on the same teams, you have great loyalty to each other. But the irony of this is that while you feel a sense of in-group with your own groups, simultaneously there's a sense of out-group with the members who are not part of your group. So out-group is a group that an individual is not a member of and may even compete with. So the division is significant sociologically because in-groups provide a sense of identification or belonging, which often produce rivalries between groups. In-group membership leads to discrimination. Given our loyalty, we favor members of our in-group. So sociologist Robert K. Martin identified a double standard produced by this. The behaviors by members of an in-group are seen as virtues, while the same behaviors by members of an out-group are viewed as vices. So dividing the world into we and them can sometimes lead to acts directed against the out-groups. Here is an interesting video on cyberbullying, which illustrate the concepts of in-group and out-groups. So we show greater loyalty and affinity toward the members of the same our in-group, but potentially show a lot of antagonism toward members of the out-group. And with the rise of social media, we've seen also the rise of cyberbullying. So as you can see here, I've given you a chart by the Pew Research Center, which is a very respectable research center that collects data on American society. As you can see here, up here it says any type of cyberbullying listed below, and that means offensive name calling, spreading false rumors, receiving explicit images that didn't ask for, and so on. Approximately 6 out of 10 teens have been targets of cyberbullying, any of these types. That's quite a lot. So if you're interested in looking at this issue a little bit more, I encourage you to go to the Pew Research Center. Okay, so lastly, reference groups. Reference groups are the groups we use as standard to evaluate ourselves, whether or not we actually belong to those groups. So this could be family or friends or popular people that we look up to. So they exert great influences over our behavior. People may change their clothing, hairstyle, speech, and other characteristics to match what the reference group would expect of them. Having two reference groups that clearly conflict with each other can, however, produce intense internal conflict. So this could be an example of when you have two conflicting reference group is like, for example, let's say you go home and your family have a certain kind of, belong to a certain subculture. The way in which they relate to each other is very different to the reference group that you look up to, let's say at work. Your co-workers relate to each other very differently. There are certain habits and rules, norms that facilitate or shape the way in which people relate to each other. So it can be conflicting for this person when they go to work, they act differently, or they look up to the reference group in order to act a certain way. Then they go home, it's their family members who have totally different set of norms and values. So that could be quite conflicting for that person. Okay, so that's it for our first part on defining groups. Next video we'll look at group size and structure.